Good evening in Canada and United States, and good morning in East Asia and Central Asia. It's my great pleasure to welcome today to our studio Dr. Rosalind Raby. Dr. Raby is a senior lecturer at California State University in Northridge. She teaches in educational leadership and policy studies and in this College of Education, and she serves as director of California Colleges for International Education, a nonprofit consortium whose membership is includes 91 California community colleges. She is also known as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Comparative International Higher Education, which is a growing community of scholars across the world. She's also deputy editor of Journal of Further and Higher Education. Dr. Raby is also an affiliate faculty at Center for Higher Education Internationalization at University Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milano. Dr. Raby has published more than in 50 academic journals and has more than 15 books on her record. And so today she'll speak on internationalization challenges. The talk is on unintended consequences of internationalization in higher education, which is part of her recent book. So without further ado, let me invite Dr. Rosalind Raby. Rosie, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Oleshechko, Anatoly, that we know. And also thank you to the Education University of Hong Kong for helping to support this talk today. Oops, my slides are not changing. There it goes. Okay, so as I'm introducing the book, you get to see the beautiful picture and also order information. We live in a neoliberalist time. But the book came together, Shahrzad Kamyab and I thought through the idea of what is an unintended consequence. We then invited scholars from throughout the world, and particularly the MENA region, to ask them what they thought the term was, because we really had a trouble finding a concrete definition. So as you can see, we have case studies from most areas of the world. So the purpose is that most actions begin with intent and they end with outcomes. But we found that unintended consequences of internationalization shows that there's action past outcomes. And these are things we don't usually think about, we ignore, we pretend that it's not there, and it results in discourse that's ambiguous, underexplored. It leads to underestimation of outcomes, missteps in evaluation, and inaccurate projections of future goals and outcomes. So we came up with our own definition because we couldn't find one that we thought fit all parameters. And we said that unintended consequences of internationalization occurs when a single or set of actions, theoretical or practical, influence new perceptions, trajectories of action, or byproducts in unexpected ways. We find that theoretically, unintended consequences frames goals and actions, and practically, it's the multiple outcomes of policies and practices. So going back to the definitions, in social science literature, Bourdon said that unintended consequences are present everywhere in social life. And this is really similar to the definition that Knight in 2009 provides, that it's something that exists. It's a little too vague for us. And so we wanted to drill down a little bit more. Lucia and Matthias say that it's inescapable reality of international politics and policies, They also talk about theoretical devices to decenter how internationalizations are studied. So here we're getting to a coherent framework. DeWitt says that it can bring something new to opportunities, but pretty much everybody else talks about it in the negative as something to avoid, undesired consequences. Lately, Bruno published talking about how unintended consequences come because of the lack of policy coordination. So in our research, we found out that it's positive and negative, and sometimes both at the same time. So what we developed was a framework to help guide our understanding of unintended consequences. And we find that there's 5 pillars in this framework. 1, unintended consequences of internationalization leads to new actions or opportunities. It leads to unforeseen actions that are not anticipated. It leads to results that have the opposite of intent. It leads to new spontaneous change, and it forces actors to take calculated risks to reinforce, alter, or reverse what has happened. So it puts the actor in a action space, because even if something's not anticipated, something happens after that. And so it's what you do with those actions that become important. So I am going to take from the case studies in our book to provide examples of these pillars in action. So the first is a historic look at national policies. And we have 3 examples of Pillar 4, spontaneous change within the historical context, and the idea that spontaneous change transforms the original intent to something new or independent actions. So in 1950s, Morocco had a national policy that approved international higher education, but spontaneous change created a discourse between the public and the private HEIs, and there ended up being infighting rather than promotion of internationalization of higher education. In 1950s, I guess 50s was an exciting point of time, Costa Rica had its first example of many of spontaneous changes. So there was a national tourism policy. Spontaneously out of that was in academic programs that developed in universities and in their version of community colleges. That in the 2000s became the basis for international collaborations. And then in 1920, Turkey's national policy supported academic mobility programs, but as unexpectedly, mass brain drain spontaneously ended this and other government-sponsored mobility programs for decades to come. If we fast forward to more contemporary times, national policies in Pillar 2 lead to unforeseen actions that are not anticipated. So in Canada, the national equity-based policies unintendedly promoted a social justice curricula based in equity and decolonialization practices, focusing on international students, internationalization at home, and education abroad. In Lebanon and Tunisia, the national policies led to mandate of a Francophone curricula. But in Lebanon at the same time, there was unforeseen research collaborations with France that raised the institutional rankings. It wasn't a purposeful attempt at that time, but it was unexpected. In Hong Kong, the university and Fulbright policies unexpectedly led to more exclusive and elite environment than was embedded itself in the policies itself. I'm not going to read all the examples I have here. So UCI as a opposite of intent. So if we look at Pillar 3, which is the opposite from intent, most every case study talked about the intent is to establish international collaborations with the global north, either in terms of mobility flows or in terms of academic research flows. And the idea was that you would enhance your standing at the university and perhaps even raise the ranking of the university. But what happened in several contexts was the opposite of intent, that the UCIs, that the HEIs, were unable to collaborate with those in the global north or in the global west. So instead, they started to collaborate with neighboring countries. This then removed the institution from a north-south centered context, but instead created a south-south context in which the HEI became the center and the other countries became the periphery. So we see this happening in South Africa, which became a hub for African countries, India as the hub for Central Asian countries. And again, remember, these are coming from the case studies. Lebanon as a hub for MENA region, Turkey as a hub for North Africa, as well as for Central Asian countries, and Costa Rica as a hub for Central American countries. Interesting that we gave no prompts to the authors and they all came up with these very similar examples. If we look at the framing of internationalization programs, Pillar 5 talks about calculated risk. So the calculated risk leads to unintended consequences that transform from the original intent. In Latvia and Nigeria, the calculated risk was to raise rankings that led to co-research projects with a Western European country, which again, this is part of what is being planned. However, in Nigeria, the unintended consequence was that as mass brain drain took the scholars away from Nigeria, a new diaspora of scholars created a context that then provided back education to the country via the internet and through technology. Another calculated risk was to transform the original intent into something quite different. And in Iran, Russia, and Tunisia, the original intent of collaboration didn't work out. And so instead, new calculated risks were created to have collaborations with China, which was, again, very interesting that we're seeing the same examples in multiple countries. COVID, how can we talk about the world today without talking about COVID? Well, COVID also had calculated risk on the basis of the university. So e-learning in Morocco and Zimbabwe, virtual exchanges in Costa Rica and India, online collaborations. What happened was that the digitalization through a calculated risk allowed some of the universities to survive and others to thrive. And some examples of the thriving is that virtual services, student services, ended up increasing the ability of incoming student mobility. That then increased the numbers, which increased the profit that then was reinvested into other campus services. This new pull is found in Russia, right in the post-COVID period. In Turkey, the pull had another unintended consequence in which the refugee international student population helped to raise the university rankings. So what we created, Shahrzad and I, was a table of comparison to see where the similarities bound with each other, to see what are we talking about in terms of positive, what are we talking in terms of negative outcomes, because remember the definitions were primarily negative, but the examples I gave are mostly in the positive. And so how do we reframe this dialogue so we're pushing for a different type of look at actions, post-actions, unintended consequences? So you could see that in terms of brain drain, Iran, Kuwait, Lebanon, Morocco, Nigeria all talked about the loss of in-country professionals as being a negative. But then some of the countries, specifically Latvia, Morocco, Nigeria, talked about internationalization as a way to stop the brain drain, because it retained the focus of the university within international collaborations, which were primarily with other areas in Europe and United States that they saw as increasing ranking. You could also see that revenue that centers on profit was mentioned in quite a few, but even more case studies talked about how the unintended consequences created new markets and allowed new markets to emerge that nobody had thought about in the first place, but ended up being quite supportive of internationalization of higher education. Racism, specifically on inbound students, was mentioned in Canada, in Hong Kong, in India, to name a few of the countries, that I thought was an interesting thing, because these are not necessarily, some of these countries are not the ones that always are talking about racism. But the idea of the interrelationships, especially with neighboring countries, creates an unequal flow that especially works with language. So in, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So some more examples of the comparisons looks at branch campus degree mills and fake EGIs as being an unintended consequence of national policies. Also, the adoption of Western curricula to change public perception, to inspire visiting faculty with the idea that if visiting faculty come, they're going to influence curriculum, and then that's going to lead to other changes. That increases employability, validation, and accreditation, as I previously mentioned. Other things where we can look at the positive and the negative, especially in language of instruction, is that faculty with English ended up creating academic divides, because some of the faculty at the university had the English skills, many did not. Some of the students had the skills, many did not. And so then you created these unintended consequences of what are you going to do, or are you going to lose that academic mindset? So some of the uniqueness, there is this complex nature of unintended consequences, and it interconnects with comparative education. Oh, it says 4 ways, but it's actually 3. I was editing this and I forgot to take that out. But it adds a new element for future research, especially if you start to break down the framework and start to look at the same situation, but in different contexts. It also calls attention to Southern and local imaginaries, because so many of the authors are writing about what's happening in their country through their visions of successful endeavors, bringing in sometimes the voices of those living in those countries, rather than bringing in the external international community. And then there was a really interesting cross-section of the belief in the public good, that at higher education supports the public good, and that then will have other effects down the line. So as I mentioned, there are negative and positive implications of unintended consequences. We could look at, as I said, the same situation, but in 2 lenses. So English as a lingua franca. In the negative, it limits inbound students who don't have English proficiency, even if they live regionally. And then if you need to bring in international students regionally, you're all of a sudden creating a problem of planning that if you don't recognize the unintended consequences, you're not going to be successful. In the positive, it does attract students and faculty from the US and the EU that then raises the HEI prestige. So you can have both of these going on at the same time. Brain drain, as I mentioned, negative. Industry in several of the case studies had limited confidence in the graduates who stay in country. Now, I know that's a flip on how we think about brain drain. So in those contexts, it was better to leave the country, and then that brings prestige through the diaspora. Positive, unanticipated push for the diaspora to lead the educational reforms. So to create courses, to create programs with certificates, is all being done by the diaspora in several of the countries. Regional qualification frameworks. The alignment forces the HEIs to abandon their existing programs. So this could be an example of the negative, but it also transfers credit as a market tool to raise rankings, which is also then seen as a positive. So you can see the interconnection between the negative, the positive, and the specific actions. So I mentioned Southern theory and local imaginaries. Several of the chapters mentioned decolonialism. So just to put things into time context, decolonialism has become extremely popular in the last few years. The authors started their chapters before public dialogue on decolonialization. And so it was very interesting, especially to me, to see how these discussions were already embedded within the academic as well as policy discourses of the case studies, the countries in the case studies. It was used in Unintended Consequences to explain how countries that are marginalized by internationalization efforts can reinforce a center-periphery construct. And that the institution is internationalized because the higher education structures come from being a former British colony or former French colony. And that was prominent in the discussions in these chapters. The local imaginaries show strengths in the case study countries. So how does Unintended Consequences counter Western hegemony? Well, you add non-English instruction to attract neighboring inbound students who speak those languages, and especially in Costa Rica, which is a really exciting example. They then become the leader in language, both in Spanish language instruction as well as in English language instruction, which attracts massive number of students from North America. So we're turning our collaborations slightly askew. It also leads to actions of decolonialization for the curricula and pedagogy by strengthening the voices of local and indigenous histories. And it blurs who is the center, as I mentioned with Costa Rica in particular, redefining who has the power within the construct of collaborations. And finally, I did mention earlier about supporting the public good, using Brandenburg's and the SDGs as examples, that Unintended Consequences serve the public good by facilitating employability and skills needed for quality life. It identifies soft skills for professions and elevates the country. It identifies curricula changes that are needed to let the students see their role in the changing world. And it contributes to the country being a regional leader and then serving the public good of not only the country, but of the region itself. And many of the case studies mentioned the fact that this type of relationship is beginning to occur. So in conclusion, the unintended consequences of internationalization have new ways of looking at internationalization of higher education and comparative education, and it adds a new definition for our field. And I'm going to step back a little bit. My co-editor, Shahrzad Kamyab, and this is for all the graduate students listening, we met at a comparative and international education society last century. And we remained friends all these years. And we always talked about doing a project together. And this book came out of those discussions. So you never know who you're going to meet at these conferences. They could change your trajectory of scholarship. So as a tool, the framework helps actors examine actions past the outcomes. As change unfolds over time, it doesn't always follow anticipated or expected pathways. And the intent is not always realized, and that's not such a bad thing, because change is not always linear. It moves some strategies forward, it intents the shift, it can even reverse the intent. But out of that could come new dialogues and new prospects. It allows internationalization to move in new and unforeseen directions, and it provides alternate ways of thinking. I think this is really important because as we move in our scholarly communities, we're so focused on our philosophical orientations or our theoretical constructs, and we see the world through those lenses. And so if you could step back and see some alternative ways of thinking, it may enhance your research in the long run. So I do want to thank everybody, and there is the book again, and I would love to have questions for some dialogue as we finish out this session.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rosie. It's a great presentation, and definitely the book itself gives us a chance really just to think more and in depth about these edges and sides of internationalization, where not everything is positive and not everything is negative. So like we have to kind of see the larger picture, right? The larger landscape, and understand how things work. But as you said before, you should remain optimistic. So that's kind of like I believe that book has been driven by a lot of optimism about unintended consequences being something good. So challenges lead to opportunities. So let us open the floor to Q&A as well as comments, and if you wish to also to share some of your experiences where these unintended consequences appear to be something really exciting or thought-provoking, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. I can see your hand, and then I can invite you to speak, or please write in the chat box, and I'll also I can see positive comments for at this point in time. So thanks indeed. So really interesting.
So there was a question in here and I'm sorry, I forgot to put on my glasses. So Nikisha, is that Nikisha
Smith? Yes.
I'm so sorry.
Right.
And so you said most of the case studies focus on unintended consequences in the global south. What about the effects on U.S. institutions? That's the next book. That's where some of you can start to take this dialogue and push it forward. We specifically chose not to bring in the United States because so many books are already focused on the United States. We wanted to see, and of course, when you're talking about your intent to collaborate with the US or the EU, there's already bringing in that context. And so we didn't quite look in that way, but I think you could find similarities in what some of the chapters or the case studies are saying. Any questions?
Vandra has a question. I can see the hand. Thank you so much. Yeah, Vandra.
Hello, everybody. I wanted to take up that point that Rosalind just mentioned about the effect on the host country. I'll give my I'll spill the beans first, and then I will talk about it. It has become evident to those of us in Canada that the government that fostered internationalization of higher education had a hidden agenda that had to do with the university's budgets. And they brought it about by charging far higher fees for both out of province students and out of country students. And that paired with the fact that particularly in Toronto, but all the major cities of Canada are having great problems with lack of housing. This has something to do with, again, something unanticipated, that the federal government in the 1970s became conservative and stopped building social and affordable housing over a period of 50 years. So we are now finding overseas students who are in our shelters who are not able to find an apartment that they can afford to rent. We also have a massive number of international students who use our food banks, and that they would, this to me is a shocking image to give the rest of the world. But going back to the beginning of my career in the 1970s, way back when Rosalind and I knew each other, but the internationalization foray or experiment was all situated in the discourse of multiculturalism and anti-racism, and that's what you've got in your chart. But that's really not all of it. That was the public image of it. I mean, we did a lot of work in the elementary and secondary schools on multiculturalism back in the 70s and 80s. And also the universities established transition programs, some of them for Indigenous peoples, but also for English people who needed upgrading in their English. And they could enroll in a one-year transition program before they even entered the regular university stream. Now, it's only been in the last 5 years that the public has become aware that the universities have had their budgets cut for many years, and that one of them, Laurentian University in Northern Ontario, is on the brink of declaring bankruptcy. And yet they have a very high number of international students. And it seems clear that the policymakers who wanted to portray this as a kind of wonderful multicultural, North and South sort of experiment, that they did not build in the support systems that would how should I put this? Sorry, I've been ill. It's hard for me to think these days. They didn't build in the support systems that would give Canada a good reputation in this regard. And even in Quebec now, we're also having problems with the Quebec government cutting funds to the English-only universities. And, as you probably are aware, Rosalind, there was an article on Facebook of this past week that professors are leaving Florida in droves, was the way it was phrased. And once you degrade the reputation of the universities, or make it impossible, as it is in the case of Florida, for people to feel that they have freedom of speech, then you get this dissatisfaction on the part of academics. So I thought, just to get to my point, that I wind my way around. The line on Canada is what it was supposed to look like. It was supposed to look that it would give everybody in the society more of a feeling of living in a diverse society where there was no official culture and 2 official languages. But in fact, with the COVID pandemic also made it worse, because we also have had weaknesses exposed in our healthcare systems. So when you have housing, healthcare, and forget the third one. Anyway, when you have those structural supports that are not built to accommodate the influx of international students. For one thing, a lot of them are thinking of going home. It's a very dissatisfying experience for them to not have anywhere decent to live in their first year that they're here, and even to have to go to the food bank. So I that's why I came tonight to hear you, because I know that this is a very complicated subject, and I applaud your efforts and those of your fellow authors to explore this. I think that it's got many layers to it, and I certainly think that looking at the effect on the United States as well. Like, here's an example in regard to the United States: the role of Mexico, of Spanish-speaking people, for example, in higher education in the United States. One has the definition of Spanish-speaking people as being, lower class, from an agricultural background, refugees, whatever. Then you have people coming from Europe who are sort of elite Spanish speakers from Spain. And yet, interestingly enough, they can even apply for some of the supports that the American Spanish speakers are also offered. So I think there's a well, I think it's going to be a whole generation before we're going to see it really roll out. So I'll conclude by
And then
saying,
there'll be unintended consequences that kind of shift the patterns
That's
as we go. And I'd like to mention a couple of things that you pointed out. The chapters in the book that talked about racism talked about this as being a problem rather than the curricula trying to overcome it. There was a little bit about how, through international education, we could all, get together very well. But the internationalization for society was primarily on making changes at the local level and then using the university as that grounding force. I see that Joseph Hoff said something about virtual exchanges in Latin America, and I think that ties into what you're saying, Vandra, that if the discourse that is currently being found in different alliances in Latin America, and tremendous amount of research being done, if it takes the Northern voice and puts it into the Latin American context, there's already inequities that are systemically being tied in. Yet, if those alliances, unintendedly or as a calculated risk, seek to bring in unique voices at the global imaginary level, we might end up seeing some really exciting research perspectives and eventual actions that might take place. But we have to keep in mind who's funding these projects and how are they coming to be. There's some at the Center for Higher International Education, wonderful students that are doing some exciting work in Latin America that are tackling the unintended consequences of this policy, that action, this ideal, and how does that kind of work through. Rebecca, I agree with you. The situation in which we put international students in the United States and Canada, I can't imagine it was ever intended to put students in such dire circumstances. But what were those venues that unintendedly changed the context? Well, of course, there's many, and that's the purpose of this type of research. So, Joseph, did I answer your question?
Who were you asking?
Sorry.
Well,
Me. Yes, I just wanted to know a little bit more. I mean, I believe what's happening in Latin America is that they are forming these networks of virtual exchange amongst themselves, separate from the US. Partly because of the language. It's a little easier if everybody speaks Spanish. I mean, and so I was just wondering, like, I agree with you. I think out of that could come some amazing collaborations and research collaborations within Latin American institutions themselves. So I was just wondering, is this happening elsewhere? And is virtual really changing the sort of progression of internationalization in ways that we didn't think about before COVID?
So I'm going to also open this up to everybody who's here, so that I'm not the only one adding to this kind of dialogue. But I think that in part it was believed that through virtual you can provide more equity, because people who can't afford to do mobility will have access to other people and to sharing other ideas. But that's not always being proven to be true, as we can take different countries and start to dissect who actually is participating or not. In the case studies in the book, there was less of a mention of students than there was a mention of policies. And so how did the bringing in of international students as a funding source create opportunities to enhance student services, or to provide avenues for refugee students to have access to education in a way that they might not have? I think that we can, again, it's this alternate ways of knowing that become really important. Oh, there you are. So what do you think?
I do believe that it has created more equity in many ways, and therefore institutions that probably didn't collaborate with each other previously maybe doing that more to some extent. Of course, it's still inequitable with all institutions, right? I mean, it depends on sort of their previous status before virtual exchange became so easily accessible. But I think it's also creating, like I said, networks that didn't exist previously. So hopefully it is enhancing internationalization in terms of especially areas in the South that never collaborated previously with fellow institutions, like you said, as in your book, even regional institutions, as well as in the global North as well as with the global North institutions.
And I'll add one more thing. I work with the community colleges in the United States, and these are like TVET colleges or other names of institutions throughout the world. And these are oftentimes institutions in the periphery. And so we can talk about how virtual, like you said, is opening up avenues for those institutions to talk to each other. It's not necessarily that they have to talk to universities. And so there's that alternative pathway that is being formed, and it wasn't directed. It wasn't wasn't part of the big picture, but it's happening nonetheless. This morning, Boston College put out a webinar in which Jamel Sameh was talking about institutions in the periphery, but he was talking about universities in the periphery, so not in the major cities, and having those connections or lack thereof. So I see a comment that says, is there any path away from internationalization of higher education? If no, what would be the missing piece in the global South to compete? What can be done to continue internationalize higher education, avoid the so-called negative? So I think, first of all, we should not be afraid of negative unintended consequences, because out of negative can come positive. but it could also spur on another negative. So I think part of it is that we have to be aware of the flows of knowledge. What is framing the situation? So here we have the ability to stop brain drain. I think that you said, oh, I'm looking at the wrong comment. Sorry about that. But here, I'll jump over to brain drain. Brain drain was, we could say by definition, it's a negative. But what came out, and this was a wonderful surprise to me, because I would never think of brain drain as being anything other than a negative. But the fact that it provided these opportunities for a diaspora to be created, and then for their influence in either providing funding or changing the curricula or opening up their own certificate type programs. I think that, again, we don't really want to lose scholars to a country, but here's a way that it shifts the dialogue just slightly. And so there was a comment about, is there a path away from internationalization of higher education? Can you explain that more?
So that's my question, and I didn't really want to assume, because like usually my answer is no, but like looking around, I'm not sure like whether like universities and also countries like have been internationalizing their higher education, because that is what they want to do or need to do. But looking around, because everyone is doing it, so now we are doing it. And also, like, of course, we have positive unintended consequences, but like, I mean, like, just look around and be honest. Like universities and countries in the global south, they struggle a lot, even in case of like brain drain and stuff like that. And also, like, one of the unintended consequences, like we want to attract international students, but the best we can do is like we have regional students. So like, is it really something that we have to do, or is there any path away from it where we don't have to?
So I wonder if we could take out, like, unpack the different aspects of internationalization of higher education. So you have, for the public good or for the personal good, it makes you a better person to know about other people. And if you could hug people, it's wonderful, because then we, add peace to the world.
My questions are, because like I'm from Vietnam, we have been trying to internationalize higher education, and I'm in Hong Kong doing my PhD at the exact same thing. But like, for example, like in Vietnam, like we tried to do it, and then we would think that by 2020 or something, we would welcome 30,000 international students or something. That didn't happen. And I went to Hong Kong, and then I thought that it would be very international on campus. That's not the case. And even when you have international students in Hong Kong, it's just like for exchange, one exchange semester. It's very, very like rare for you to see like one international student like from the US, the UK, or Europe to go to Hong Kong to do the full program. So I mean, like, even like internationalization of education, like to what extent are we in internationalizing? Yeah, so that's why I'm asking the question. Yeah.
I love your question. I think it opens up so many different ideas, that part of mobility research is showing that it's becoming shorter and shorter term. Is that a financial thing? Is it a disciplinary thing that there's a series of courses you have to take and you can't step away for too long? Is it, 1,000 other examples? But how that then affects those long-term students. So you're there to stay and others are coming and going. And are you really making a relationship? Or a lot of research that's coming out of the United States on international students is showing that they're not connecting with the domestic students as much. They're hanging out with those from their own countries or even neighboring countries. So where is that idealized internationalization. Well, I'm going to say idealized anything is idealized. You know, as I was, you know, saying that, you know, we have this vision, but it's then kind of blown up by neoliberalism. And it's also blown up by colonial relationships. And I think that we have to take a step back to take a step forward. And I think your question is a wonderful one. That's why I asked to have you explain it a little bit more so we could, you know, have a dialogue. And Rebecca said this is a provocative question. And so another agreement that you had a great question. And wonder about the tension between attractive ideals of internationalization and the performativity of it linked with higher ed branding and lived realities of so can I just say yes? I see here neoliberalism, yes, but I'm just going to say yes. Our field is so complicated. And depending on who you're talking to and what their vision is, it can be unpacked in different ways. And I think it's up to you guys, the next generation of wonderful scholars, to be able to ask these great questions and start to move forward as to, well, what does this really mean? And, you know, are we living in an era where you can get TV shows? Okay, I'm old-fashioned. I would say TV shows. I think you guys would say satellite shows or YouTube shows or something that from anywhere in the world. So do you really need that formalized education when it's already informal? And what does language have to do? Does language open up doors or does it close doors? I think all of that is really important. And I also wonder about scholars such as yourself, who will you go back to Vietnam? And what will your change construct be for being away? Will you be welcomed? Will you need to rediscover yourself in light of being away for so many years in a different context? And what will that mean to you as a scholar? I think it's going to make you better. But these are all topics that, you know, 50 years ago, we didn't ask these questions, but we're asking them now. And thank goodness. So I do wish you really good success as you move through. Any other comments?
I saw in Rebecca's comment the emphasis on agency, and I like that topic in terms of intentions. Whose intentions we are talking about, right? Who achieves or receives this kind of consequences in terms of, you know, my intentions get fulfilled or become unsuccessful and so on, right? So who is that? The government, the institution, the president, the dean, the professor, or the student himself, herself, who you know, think about success or lack of such. So and these are kind of some issues that also need probably more thinking in terms of how we conceptualize this internationalization strategies, in terms of who needs to achieve and what and how and where we
And
are.
what achieve means.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, achievement to one person is not going to be the same as achievement to another person. And, you know, if you go on one pathway, what's the unintended consequences that are going to happen? So I'm going to kind of have you guys start to think a little bit differently about our actions, our discourse, even goals and outcomes might now have a little bit of a fuzzier bent to them. And please, if anybody has questions, and please feel free to email me and contact me at any time.
And we're approaching the end of this seminar webinar. And I would like to thank Dr. Raby for this wonderful presentation, making us think more about the depths of internationalization strategies and intentions. And I very much appreciate your time with us, Rosie, and giving us a chance to kind of meet you in person online. We haven't had many chances recently to see each other, but and pandemic was one of these obstacles, and we just also one of the conditions in which HOA feels that there is no so much international students traveling these days, right? We also should keep that in mind, that these kinds of major geopolitical or epidemiological issues come our way, and we just become blocked in our intentions. So thank you, Rosie, and
thank you.
This
To
webinar
be in this space was wonderful.
Thank you. This webinar was also sponsored by the Consortium for Higher Education Research in Europe. The Europeans were not able to join us this time, but we look forward to getting more engagement across the planet. So let's stay in touch, and many thanks everyone, and have great holidays wherever you are. Thank you.
Yes.